my purpose this morning is really to give something of a taster to the theology of the body. So I think I have until about, I think it's 10 o'clock. So Ben, you might want to call out a few minutes before then if we're getting close to time. I'm happy to be interrupted, that's no problem. But we won't be able to go into great depth on every aspect of the theology of the body. And I'm aware that some of you might be a little bit familiar with it already. Some of you will be less familiar with it. Some of you, it might even be a relatively recent or new idea. What I want to give you is a little bit of a taster of where I think John Paul II was coming from. And one of the reasons this is important is I think because we do live in a time of great confusion about the body. There's a great emphasis everywhere we look in our culture in Australia at this present moment on the autonomy of the body, on making individual choices, of expressing power over my own body and the choices I make and the direction I take with my life. John Paul II attempted to delve deep within the Catholic tradition, and what he found and discovered there is something that has always been the case, but he articulated it very beautifully, that actually the Christian approach to the body is very different. We do value the individual, we do value the power of individual choices that we make, but John Paul II taught that actually the body itself is a gift. And in that sense, it is a gift given not for our own self, but a gift given for the sake of loving another and loving others. Now, the primary focus always, as you would expect from a pope, let alone a bishop or a theologian, hopefully, with John Paul II, is that the primary other to all of us is God himself. Now, John Paul II, some of you will know him by his Polish name, some of you that won't be as recognisable, but Karol Wojtyła, as an early, right from his early days as a seminarian, as an actor and a writer, as a poet, as a philosopher, but certainly after his ordination as a pastor, took great interest in what he called the mystery of human love. So the mystery of love between human beings, and in particular, the case of marriage. Now, what I'll be doing this morning is just giving you that very basic introduction. And then I want to talk about the body and the gospel, or the good news, and then picking up some words from John Paul II, the practical effect of all of this for us, because I'm aware that many of you in the room this morning are thinking through what the vocation of marriage and family life is all about, and thinking about your own personal life and decisions that you'll be wanting to make. So that turn of phrase from John Paul II, let it be a real theology and a real body. John Paul II gave 129 addresses over the course of 5 years and on this topic, and in summary, it's referred to as the theology of the body. That is a term he used, but it wasn't the way that he summed up his whole project here. Now, what happened is, as a bishop in Poland, leading up to 1978, when he was elected Bishop of Rome, Wojtyła had written these addresses. And in his mind, he was preparing this as a book or a collection of short chapters, trying to unpack what he called the spousal meaning of the body. So all of you will be familiar with the term spouse. This refers to your husband or your wife in married life. Many of you will have seen now that in many government forms that you might have to fill out now, that often you won't even have the option of ticking wife or husband anymore. If you're lucky, you can pick spouse, but that's it. We live in a time in which even the language of marriage, that's just a small thing in the scheme of things, but the meaning and the importance that I am a husband to someone in particular, or that my wife is a wife to someone in particular, is lost and increasingly lost in our culture. And John Paul II emphasised the spousal meaning of the body. And what he meant by that is not that every human being is called to marriage, because we're not. Some are called to the priestly vocation or ordained life, perhaps to the diaconate. Some are called to a single life, which is another area that the church has perhaps not given enough attention to, the importance and the value of that in the life of the body of Christ. But another, of course, is the religious life. I don't know, Ben, if we have any religious in the room this morning, but some of you will have encountered those who are brothers and sisters in the religious life or who live in community. That is another of the important vocations in the church. The most common, though, even now, at a time when marriage is increasingly destabilised in our culture, the most common, and the most common historically for most Christians, has generally been married life. That means, therefore, that when John Paul II is addressing the spousal meaning of the body, he is saying that there's something about marriage which sits at the heart of every vocation. So, although marriage is the common experience for most Christians over time, it's also something which goes to the heart of the Christian life itself. Because John Paul II was keen to emphasise that the Christian life itself is spousal, in the sense that we are called to a deep communion with God through Christ Jesus. Now, each of us will have a different experience of that. There's a uniqueness to every Christian journey. But this idea that we are all called to communion with God, who in a sense is our first spouse. So some of you know about the Franciscan life or the Franciscan tradition. One of the early phrases used for brothers in the Franciscan life was the little brides of Christ. Now, they were brothers, they were men, they weren't women as such, but this idea that they were called into such a deep, loving service with God, of living for God and not themselves, is the spousal meaning in John Paul II's idea. Now, when John Paul II talks about the spousal meaning of the body, he's keen to emphasise that we aren't wrestling here with just concepts and ideas. This is not merely an academic or a scholarly exercise. And he says these words: this isn't mere wrestling with images carried in our thoughts. We fight with the likeness of all things that inwardly constitute man. So for John Paul II, his interest in human life, in understanding it, respecting it, learning more deeply about it, is something which for him is something of a fight, a lifelong struggle, trying to understand the human condition and our deep spousal calling for others. And this is something he wants to invite others into. It's something which his successor, Pope Benedict, took up, and again Pope Francis has taken up, both with their own particular language and aspects that they emphasise. But this idea that at the heart of Christian life is wrestling with what it is to be human. And not only that, but finding in marriage a way of understanding this great and glorious vocation to which we're all called, even in all the messiness and the ordinariness of our lives. But we live in a strange time where closeness and intimacy can often be abused or misunderstood or disregarded. We live in a time where people might live virtually and conflicts arise out of this. So Some of you will be familiar with this cartoon from a few years ago now. Most people comment on this cartoon and see it as about this obsession that some will have with life on the internet. So the life of arguing, of taking up an issue, of getting political on Facebook or social media, or battling it out on Twitter, or soaking up the news on social media from the morning when you wake up all the way to the evening, and the way that this takes us away from real people in our lives. I also think it's a commentary on intimacy and marriage in a sense. There's a sense in which this is the image of someone who has lost a sense of what's important, of what they're called to in their own vocation. And it's a reminder that Christianity is about the spirit, but it's also about the body. And in that sense, we are called to be incredibly practical people. Catherine of Siena, one of my favourite of the saints, said that the true saint is someone whose heart is in the clouds, but whose feet are dirty. And her point was that you love God, you live for God, but you are very much involved in the dust and the debris of the world, that we have a work to do here. And primarily that is a work with other people. One of the results of the tendency in recent decades to, in one sense, empower the body, but increasingly think of ourselves as individuals, not as called to communion with others, is that we end up with various images of the body. So we have that disincarnate notion almost. But out of that, because we can't escape the body, because none of us can be pure spirit, even if we think we can control and manipulate the body, we end up deconstructing and then reconstructing the body in our own image. We have this image from Salvador Dali here, which is a great one, I think, in terms of it's almost like a person trapped in a really awkward, difficult state of their own body. It's not an inspiring image. I don't look at this image and feel like this is something I want to be part of. But there's a strangeness to it. And there are different compartments. There's drawers, almost like a cabinet, as part of the body here. And there's this idea that within the body you have this separation, different sections for different purposes. Rather than having, in John Paul II's words, a spousal meaning or a calling. Which is why John Paul II returns repeatedly to Scripture. And I want to remind us here of those words in 1 Corinthians. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching is in vain, and your faith is in vain. We need to recall the cross, but the hope of our lives is in the resurrection. And at the heart of our faith is this commitment to this faith, this belief, this understanding, this new life that is opened up for us. We don't create it. It's not something we construct in our own time. It's something we are invited into. And so when we have the proclamation of the gospel, which doesn't just happen in the pulpit, in fact, preaching at Mass is one of the smaller sort of examples, if you like, of real proclamation in the life of the church. The great proclamation of the faith is the living out of our faith and the sharing of that faith with others. Now, if we're called to share that faith closely and lovingly, marriage becomes a particularly striking example of a way of living in which we are called to share something important and good particularly with one other person in a very close and intimate and challenging way. But all of it is in light of the resurrection. John Paul II said, "The resurrection constitutes the definitive accomplishment of the redemption of the body." He actually says the whole course of the biblical story, from Genesis onwards, is concerned not just with the spirit, but with the body. The whole biblical story, the Christian gospel, from the beginning to the end, has a bodily element. And this is challenging for us. I like to imagine the biblical story about is one which, in a sense, begins in a garden and ends in a city. In the garden, we have our first parents, Adam and Eve, and the story, and the great tragedy of the fall. But we also have this constant promise that God reissues to his people of closeness, of protection, of care. And in the end, we are brought together in communion with one another in that heavenly or that eternal city. So I'd like to say a word now about the body and the gospel. I might just check in as well, because I can't see or hear you. Can everybody hear me well? You might well be on mute, so I'm just going to assume that you can. So a word on the body and the gospel. John Paul II, in his pastoral ministry, as many bishops and priests in our own time are doing now, particularly, has had a great interest in married life and the fruit of married life. Now, the obvious fruit of married life, the one that we will think of most commonly, is of children. That's not always the case in every marriage. But this, in the church's understanding, is, if you like, that fruit that is most visible. The gift of human life is a gift beyond any kind of understanding. It's not something that we own. It's not something that we're called to manipulate or to control. It's a gift. And it is meant to be received purely as a gift. And as gift, we mustn't think here of the present under the Christmas tree, the gift that is just for your use, new shoes or a new shirt. It's not the gift that is given for your entertainment, the movie voucher or something else. It's not even just the gift for shared goodness, like the promise of a meal with someone, or the promise of an event, or tickets to something that you've been wanting to go to. It's a gift that bestows responsibility on you. So when the married man or the married woman enters into the gift of marriage, it is extraordinary that part of the good news can be the gift of a child. And even when that happens, that child bestows on the parents that gift of responsibility to be a father or a mother. In doing this, it challenges us to start reflecting on how we use our own bodies, how our bodies express love to one another in married life, but more generally in the life of the church. There's a nice quote here from another theologian. The body of the Christian individual, as well as the body of Christians together, is the temple, the preeminent dwelling place of God with men and women. And this dwelling place is the body of Christ. We do not just bear ourselves to one another, we also bear the person of Christ to one another. And we do this within a hope, a certain hope of what will be promised in the body to us. Not many people will use the book of Revelation in reflecting on marriage. But I think, and something John Paul II did and others have done, and I think it's really helpful to think about the last book of the Bible. I should say that I came to the Catholic faith as an adult, so I had a background in another Christian tradition, a more evangelical tradition before that. But one of the things that I love about our Catholic faith is that, if you like, we're that community in the world that has been given the gift of seeing the last page of the story ahead of time. And in the book of Revelation, we find some of it is dramatic, some of it is disturbing, some of it is challenging, but it also carries a promise. And that promise is of that eternal city to which I was referring before. I love this language that we have here. It's embodied language from the book of Revelation. The hairs of his head were white, like white wool, like snow. His eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze, refined in a furnace. And his voice was like the roar of many waters. In his right hand he held 7 stars. From his mouth came a sharp two-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in full strength. In Australia, in the summertime, you know what the sun in full strength can do. This is an embodied image. It's one of Christ, the resurrected one, whose new life is filled with this power and this presence that is not our own. And before it, we're able to see something of what we are promised, to participate and share in that body. On our way to that, we're called to share the gospel, to live it, to love it, to understand it, to help one another understand it more fully. Karol Wojtyła, this is one of my favourite images of him as a younger priest who would take young people on what we would call a bushwalk, but long treks through the Polish forest. He enjoyed camping and being outdoors, and they would take canoes and in the morning turn the canoe upside down and celebrate Mass outdoors with everybody. He said, the theology of the body is not merely a theory, but rather a specific evangelical Christian pedagogy of the body. For John Paul II, the living out of the gospel in our bodies with one another is a way of proclaiming God's love for others. It is not that the body is incidental or that the body will be passed away completely. Rather, we live in our bodies something that is meant to be a sign of love given for one another. And in married life, the meaning of the body happens in a number of different ways. It happens primarily sacrificially, by giving up all of those things that I would like to have for myself, and giving up those things for the sake of my spouse, and then my children and my family. That includes all of what I might aspire to in the world. It includes all my ambitions and my hopes. It includes what one does with one's work, what one does with one's money, and of course, in that most obvious sense, it involves sexuality. And so for the Christian vision of married life, sexuality is about an openness and a givenness to human life with one other person in close intimacy. In our culture now, that has become a challenge and something that is not easy to live. But like Ben and others there today, my hope is that in the church we will work harder and better at supporting those who are testing the vocation of married life and those who are married, praying for them and supporting them. which is why at the heart of the church there is this image which, if you like, is strange to us. It's the image of the nuptial mystery of Christ and his bride, the church. You will hear in the life of the church negative things said about the body. You will hear quotes and language from Christians from time to time where the body seems to be disregarded. That's probably not a surprise, because in the body we also experience great suffering and vulnerability, and in the body we also see what evil people can do to one another. John Paul II says of the mystery of being a human person and being an embodied person, this mystery can be explained only on the basis of the truth that man is called to communion, to a share in the fullness of the Trinitarian life of God, the communio personarum. In the Christian life, and in fact in human life, the body is full of surprise. We imagine we know a person, and they surprise us. There's always that sense of something new in the body and in the person. And married life is no exception. My own doctoral supervisor, who was a Scottish priest, Father Mike Purcell, used to say to me, the great mystery of human life is that after 30 years of married life, a husband and a wife can wake up on a Saturday morning and have something new to say to one another. It is helpful and I think important to meditate a little bit on the mystery of human love, because it illustrates something about the life of the Christian vocation anyway. It's easy to imagine human people, human persons, as part of a mass of people. It's all too much to take in at one go. It's easy to rush through the crowd. I used to talk at this moment in giving this kind of address of talking through the busyness of the shopping centre, but I almost feel that after 2 years of COVID and lockdowns and social distancing, that's not the best image to use. But even in recent months, whether it's Tasmania or Victoria or anywhere, we've seen a little bit more of things opening up and people getting accustomed to crowds again. But when we find ourselves face to face with another, not just in the crowd, but in that uniqueness of a particular relationship, we find a closeness and something that startles us. But the image that I have in front of you right now, also, like this one, is not the right image. Because when we find someone in front of us who we're called to love and care for, we find someone who is unique and unrepeatable. And I want to repeat those words from John Paul II. Every human person is unique and unrepeatable. David Bentley Hart, another writer that I admire quite a lot, said, "The face of the other, for Christian eyes, must of necessity be visible only in the peculiarities of its features. The other has a world, and therefore the world has in him or her a face." Which is why I think it's important to take up the words of John Paul II, that when we think about married life and human life, we should let it be a real theology and a real body. There is no sense in trying to plant onto another person, especially if we're considering the married life with them, some perfect image or construct upon them of what a husband or a wife is meant to be. We have to encounter them in the flesh. with their weaknesses and their strengths. Those elements that are wonderful and glorious and mysterious and inviting, and those elements that are difficult or challenging or frail and all too human. Because it's precisely in that mystery that we find ourselves again faced with the calling of God Himself in the body of another. Just the other day, we had again in the cycle of readings for Mass, the wedding at Cana. And I want to finish here with this image because it is probably my favourite gospel reading for a Sunday when we have the wedding at Cana. Because Christ's entire public ministry began at a wedding. So for married couples, even when things are difficult, or on a Sunday morning when getting to Mass is difficult. And I have 5 children, and I know that whether you've got 1 or 10 kids, the battles that you have to get into the car and to get to Mass after a long and difficult week, or a busy week, or a tiring week, are real. But somehow about pushing through and getting into the habit of loving one another and making the Eucharist the heart of married life is a challenge that is worth continuing to struggle for. I don't think it's a surprise or an accident that the Lord began His public ministry at a wedding. And I don't think it's accidental that in the book of Revelation we are promised the wedding banquet of the Lamb. And I don't think it's an accident that when we began the entire journey, it started with Adam and Eve as parents, and as husband and wife, as mother and father. And I don't think it's an accident that all of this is tied together in a way that illustrates to us the importance of the spousal call, which belongs to each of us, whether we're religious or ordained or single or married in the world, that there is a calling of communion that happens deep within our own heart, for which only God in His splendour can answer. And I don't think, therefore, it's an accident that you, in particular today, are being invited to test that vocation and to take on the adventure of exploring what that spousal meaning means for you in married life or in some other vocation.